When I first started teaching at UVA, I would get a notice, maybe once a year from the dean's office, basically reporting that there was a student kind of in severe difficulty, and to kind of, work with that student to kind of get them through my class in that semester. This is back, I have to confess, in 2002. But what's happening nowadays is that I will get a notice, often once every 2 weeks, once a month, indicating there's a student in my class in some kind of severe difficulty of a kind of a psychological nature. And so this is just kind of like one data point that's sort of, I think, suggestive of how much has changed and is changing in recent years when it comes to the emotional well-being of our young adults here in the US. But what exactly has changed? What's going on here? And to help us kind of think through this question, I'm delighted to welcome UVA Professor Joe Davis, and his talk tonight is entitled, "Why So Anxious? Understanding the Roots of Youth Anxiety." Research professor of sociology and the director of the Picturing the Human Project at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. His research explores the intersecting questions of self, morality, and cultural change. His newest book is Chemically Imbalanced: Everyday Suffering, Medication, and Our Troubled Quest for Self-Mastery. He also recently co-edited The Evening of Life, The Challenges of Aging and Dying Well. And he is now writing the new Discontents blog at Psychology Today. So, given all that he's been writing of late, given his recent books, I think he's uniquely well qualified to sort of help us think through what's sort of going on with our adolescents and our young adults today in the US. And so with that, I'm going to turn over the stage electronically to Joe. Joe, thanks for being with us tonight.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Michael, for having me. And thanks to all of you who are tuning in tonight. I hope I don't contribute to your Zoom fatigue. As Brad said, that part of the subtitle of my recent book was called Our Troubled Quest for Self-Mastery. And now I'm working on a new book that really addressing, in some sense, the same sort of problem, the problem of self-mastery and the problem by the way in which we understand and define that. And so this is, but this book, unlike the past one, will focus specifically on the troubles of young people, meaning basically high school and college age youth. The teaser copy you got from Michael for it tonight said that my answer to why so anxious might surprise you. I don't know if it will, but the answer I want to offer is that many troubles of youth, much anxiety, depression, etc., are arising not from obstacles to freedom and self-development, but from the very standards and ideals of success that we have for them. Okay, not from obstacles, but rather from the very terms in which we define what it's good to be and what it means to be successful and fruitful. Here's a quote from a college student. I'll just call her Madison. "I grew up," she says, "trying to be perfect, well-rounded and high-achieving student. I enrolled in all APs and attended governor's school. I played a musical instrument my entire childhood. I participated in 3 different sports throughout the year, and I held leadership positions within several organizations. However," you knew that was coming, "however, I was very unhappy, despite being so successful and involved." Now, I want to suggest that in order to understand this sort of trouble, what we need to consider is what young people are expected to be, what kind of people they're expected to be. And Madison is a good example, but also, and more importantly, how they are supposed to be. Okay, how they are supposed to be. The things that Madison does, the things that she excelled at are naturally good things. Good student, musician, athlete, leader, right? Every parent would be proud. So there must be something else that's awry, okay? Something that is undermining the goods involved and causing a lot of distress. So that's what I want to talk about. It's like, what is it that seems to be awry? So I'll begin with a few comments on distress levels. Won't need to belabor that. Then I'll look some at the qualities of what sort of persons that we expect young people to be and the nature of those expectations. And then I want to end with one point about what we can do. Okay, so that's my goal. Okay, young people, as we know, are struggling. Of course, there's the special circumstances and difficult circumstances of the pandemic, but this in some ways probably is only accelerating a trend of increasing problems that have been with us for some time. And though my title concerns anxiety, what I have to say about the standards of what it's good to do and good to be can generate pervasive feelings of powerlessness, disappointment, and inadequacy that might manifest themselves as depression, eating disorder, self-harm, like cutting, which is very common, school refusal, alcohol, drug abuse, sleep problems, and so on. So not just anxiety in that sort of narrow sense. But let me show you a couple of things. I'm going to share my screen with you. And then put this up to the slideshow. There we go. Can everyone see that? Michael, can you see that?
Yep.
Okay, good. All right. So this is from a large US survey done by the National College Health Association. And they do this semi-annually. This one was done with 54,500 undergrads at 98 institutions in the US. All right, and the findings are roughly comparable to others like it, like the American Freshman Study done at UCLA, which mainly surveys freshmen, hence about their final year of high school, or the Healthy Minds studies out of the University of Michigan, and so on. But I picked out a few things from their study that gives you a sense for kind of levels of distress. These are questions they ask of students, and they're additive. So the way they ask the question is, did you feel things were hopeless in the past 2 weeks? If not, did you think so in the last 30 days, et cetera? And they continue with year and so on. But so these numbers combine. So you get pretty high levels of distress. Sorry, I jumped to screen accidentally. Uh-oh. Okay, what happened? Sorry, we got to get back to the right one. Okay, so, but you can see there felt overwhelming anxiety, 45%. Okay, so pretty high numbers. Also, this is lots of students are seeking professional help and treatment. This is from the same NCHA study. What they found is about a third of students, 33% of students, 36% female, 23% of males, had been diagnosed or treated for a mental health problem in the past 12 months. Okay, so about a third of university students. And I marked there in yellow. So anxiety and panic attacks are numbers 1 and 3 on the list, with depression there in the middle. And you get some idea of the other sorts of problems and so on that people are experiencing. Okay. I won't take the time now, but numbers from other countries. And the problem I'm going to describe is not at all limited to the United States, right? These kinds of problems are widespread in the whole Western world and beyond. And also, although these are college students who are intensively studied, there's another group that's barely ever studied, and that are people of roughly the same age who don't go to college. But the limited data available, and it is quite limited, suggests that they experience problems at roughly the same rate as college students. Okay, so roughly the same rate for non-college age young people. Okay, so let me stop sharing. And I'll come back to I want to get back to, so that's now to our question, why so anxious? Okay, and the answer I want to offer is, will be based on interviews that I've done with young people and parents. And the key question really been asking students is how they understand the schemes of respect and success in their world, and how therefore they believe they're expected to live and conduct their relations with others. Okay. Now let me, oh, I'm actually, should have just kept sharing it, I guess. I want to go back again, sharing the screen again. Whoops. Okay, now how do I advance? Sorry, I've gotten something wrong. Okay, here we go. Okay, here's a list. All right. This list comes primarily from discussion with college students at selective universities. Okay. Now, it's not necessarily the case that these students hold all these values as the most important to them. All right. Some talk about how they're in some sense trying to live differently. I'll give you one example. This is a young woman who says, to be good in my eyes has shifted from mere accolades and achievements to more character-based values and qualities that are inherent in people rather than things that one can train herself to do. Okay, so she's operated under these norms in a way, and now is trying to focus on somewhat more internal or character-based norms. Okay, but even the students who express some distance from these also acknowledge the power they have over them, and that they struggle with feelings of disappointment and inadequacy in regard to them. Okay, so there's the list. These are the things that are kind of condensed into 9 things. And in some ways, I could probably condense even further into 2 things, and that would be to stand out and to be socially adept. Those are the 2 that really come across in any kind of discussion. But there you can see a unique, standing out, different from others. I hope these are relatively self-explanatory, and I'm not going to illustrate them or go into cases, but socially outgoing, confident, adept, but also having a big network, smart, or academically gifted, and those may be the same thing, although there's different kinds of smart. And then hardworking, self-disciplined, self-controlled, accomplished, right, and so on, a life plan, a purpose, etc. Now, there are social class differences too between these things. Obviously, this sounds like a list from college students at a select university. But since schools and parents and employers convey something of these same values with varying degrees of intensity to everyone, it seems like no one is free of them. And also, as I'll note below, the peer group or family is typically the basis for comparison. All right, so that means that young people from different environments will differently judge or distinguish themselves depending on the norms in that particular environment. Okay, so there are no limits really to the ways in which someone might try to stand out from the crowd. Maybe it's being a social media star. Maybe it's being an expert on certain forms of sneakers, right? Maybe it's a skateboard champion, and so on. So these things are not necessarily geared to the exact same things, but I do want to suggest there's a kind of common normativity that would go across classes, though again will be differentially experienced, and so on. Okay, in addition, of course, young people also reference qualities such as the need to be kind, caring, a good listener, helpful toward others, and the like. All right, it's not all about being the best. Okay, I want to emphasize that. However, but even these virtues could sometimes be spoken about for their strategic value. Okay, so for instance, often in conversations, they're mentioned in the context of being socially successful or making the right impression or building a strong network. Okay, it was, for instance, as one student said, it's good to be friends with the right people. Okay, so sometimes even the qualities, the virtues, and so on, right, could often also be spoken of in a kind of way in which they're being leveraged to achieve some kind of other sort of success, right, than the good of the relationship itself, for instance. Okay, now these are all good things, right? It's hard to say about any one of those that, oh, that's really a bad thing. Those are good things, right? The trouble arises, it seems to me, is because these norms of what it's good to be and so on don't stand alone, so to speak. They're part of a larger competitive scheme that undermines the good in them and almost guarantees anxiousness, disappointment, exhaustion, failure, and so on. Okay. So that's what I want to really try and pick out. What is it about this competitive scheme, right? And I want to pick out six things. And this is at the latest count, right? I'm still working on this stuff. So, but I think that'll give us a sense for these features. And then I hope when I get through them, we'll have a much better understanding why they might be throwing off so much anxiety and distress. Okay, so that's the idea. All right, now my next slide. Good, okay. First, the norms are a package. Okay. All of them should be cultivated, right? And as much as possible. All right, and this is often expressed by students as being well-rounded, right? And what they mean by that is not what they would have meant when I was in high school, right? Now it means something like you're good at everything, okay? So all the 9 things, you're doing all of them, and you're being very successful at it. All right, here's one student. She describes it is the balance of maintaining all these things simultaneously and seemingly effortlessly that creates the background expectation that is truly never spoken of as an issue. Okay, I think that's an important point. That's the idea, that's being well-rounded. All right, and that's a background expectation. Another student, as I reflect on what drives my motivation in life, the answer is that I always wanted to be effortlessly impressive. I wanted to be naturally intelligent, interesting, carefree, strikingly beautiful first thing in the morning, compassionate, selfless toward my enemies, and motivated to achieve a successful career without any idea of what that should be. Okay. And then finally, the third one, a common sense of failure that many students report is in not being all of these things. Okay. As one student who was quite accomplished said, I mean, a young woman like Morgan earlier, she said, I'm a very shy person by nature, and over time I've come to terms that is just a part of my personality. But there are times in which I hate that this is the way I am. Okay, and again, I can't tell you how many times I talk with students who are 8 of the 9, if you will, on that list, but somehow not the 9th, right? And they're actually on a medication because they're not good enough at parties, or they're not somehow outgoing enough or successful enough, and so on. Okay, so that's the first feature of them, right? Is that they come as a package. Okay, darn it. Why isn't it advancing? There we go. Okay, second is that they are comparative. Okay, they're comparative to some reference group of peers or family members. Could be siblings, sometimes it's parents. All right, and comparing their success or where they're at to someone else. All right, and by and large, comparison is the only way to determine if you're measuring up, right? There's no blood test for these things, right? And there's the expectation, not just that you'll do as well, but you'll actually do better than others. And so this is a matter often of comparison. Here's a guy who says, unfortunately, I, and in my experience, most other people my age, tend to look for evidence of what I am capable of being and what others are. All right. Or another student. It's hard not to compare yourself to the success of others, especially when you may be having difficulties in one or more aspects of your life. Young adults are expected to be the best of the best in every aspect of their lives. And when they don't live up to those standards, it is hard not to feel as if you are inadequate or have failed. All right. Let me add here, social media have come to play a very important role in this process of comparison. We give you just one example of a study from last summer. This was a study of students at 3 private high-achieving schools. And the researchers found that peer comparisons over social media really fan the flames of competition and pervasive feelings of falling short. Across all the school samples, there were consistent and pronounced links between peer comparisons and anxious, depressed, and withdrawal depressed symptoms. The peril was in the comparisons, they observed, not, as has been suggested, simply in the amount of time spent on social media. Okay, so it's not just that people are on social media, what are they doing on it? And one of the things they're doing is comparing themselves. to each other. Here's a guy who says, the third one there, I constantly compare myself to others on social media, which causes me to think I'm not in good enough shape or attractive enough, leading to a life of dissatisfaction. Okay, so these norms are comparative. Okay, how are you doing? Right, again, this is part of a kind of a competitive environment. Okay, third, the norms are instrumental to other purposes. Okay, these qualities are not treated as goods in themselves, but only become good when they are used for some strategic gain, some tangible achievement, social prestige, economic success, getting into the right college, and so on. Okay, this is what Morgan, who I read her case at the beginning, this was her problem. Her activities, such as music and sports, right, for her became drained of any real satisfaction because she had come to view them as merely ways to leverage getting into the best university she could. Okay. So that whatever intrinsic qualities there are to being to playing a sport, the enjoyment of the sport, the enjoyment of making music and so on, right, it slowly drained out of it for her, right, as she increasingly, right, simply used them as ways to leverage getting into the best university. Here's another student, the longer quote there. One is expected to shine and make every minute of your leisure time count in the pursuit of higher productivity and something that can be monetized or placed on your resume. Anything you do for fun, you should do seriously enough for it to be your side gig or to have a leadership position. Otherwise, you're not really good at or making use of your time. It is this mentality, she says, that led me to not only value my musical skills, if I am majoring in it, getting grants and getting paid to do gigs. Okay, again, the point is not to make music, to enjoy the music, right, and so on, but to use the music to get other things, to instrumentalize it to some other end. Okay, that's the point. And then last one there, Frank. When I was applying to college, he says, there were kids who were in 10 plus clubs and 2+ sports at the same time, not for any enjoyment, but simply because it showed they were dedicated, driven, and doing something with a talent they were told they had. Look at any high school now, and it's a shark pool. Okay, so they're instrumental. Next one. They are performative. Okay, performative. For the qualities, good looking, good in school, right, having a plan, etc. The qualities to be of strategic value. You have to seek attention and visibility and positively affect others with your self-representations, personal characteristics, and quality of life. Okay, so you can't just be good at the instrument. You have to, right? You have to perform in the sense of seeking attention and visibility, so that people know that you're good at it, right? Right. Again, obviously, this fits with the idea of it being instrumental to some other end. It has to be seen. Okay, but it adds another layer of complication. Your qualities, in a sense, have to be performed in such a way that you make the right impression, that they appear to be effortless, just being your special self. Okay, so here's a few quotes from students. I've realized now that it's good to be studious and hardworking, but not too hardworking to avoid being labeled as desperate. Here's another one. Success is doing everything at once and looking good while doing it. Okay, another one. It is good if we are attractive, but not so attractive that we attract too much attention. All right, and then finally, I think it is good to be smart, but not too know-it-all. Okay, again, you have the sense here in which you can be these things, you can have these qualities, but you have to perform them in the right way or they can kind of backfire, right, on you. Rather than being seen as strengths, they're seen as weaknesses and so on, right? You're seen to be boring or you're seen to be, right, difficult and so on, even though you're really quite good or successful at it. Number 5, these qualities reveal one's inherent worth. Right? They make you somebody. All right. And this moral dimension is often expressed as what not to be or do. Right. And I'll give a quote here from something I wrote some years ago with a different sample of kids. Right. But I'll read it to you. The achievement norms, what I'm calling good to be, are manifested as contrast with the fears and challenges to self-image that the students report. Fears that they might not be ridiculously smart, and these are quotes from students, but mediocre, not impressive or interesting, but weird or boring, not confident, but awkward and self-conscious, not self-disciplined and productive, but a slacker and unmotivated, not strong, but weak and pitiable, not self-sufficient, but dependent, not perfect, but a loser. Okay, so there you get, I think, a good sense for, right, what's at stake, right, in the kinds of things that it's good not to be. Okay, and these are highly normatively loaded things, right? None of those are things you want to be. All right, and then here's a quote from a student along these lines. She says, "I suck because I haven't taken advantage. There have been opportunities that I could have taken that I think would have made me happier. And I berate myself, and I'm like, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you? You had the opportunity." And then when I asked her what would be wrong with just not taking advantage of these opportunities, she responds, "Because then I'm a loser." Okay, so it's almost a kind of ontological demotion, right? Because she's not optimizing herself. She's not doing everything she can. She's missing opportunities, right? And then lastly, which barely needs saying, I guess, these norms are unforgiving. Okay, because they're about you in a sense, right? The kind of person you are, right? Failures must be hidden, compensated for. And by the way, I've written, in fact, I did one recently on my blog about kids taking Adderall without a prescription, right? And very often what they say is the reason they're taking it is because it levels the playing field. It allows them to operate at a higher level relative to their peers, right? And they feel like they're behind and so on. So they're compensating for the fact that they're not everything they're supposed to be, and then, or adequately explain. And this is where psychiatric diagnoses can often provide a sense of relief, right? There are endless ways to fail. Okay, I guess that's one of my main points here. There are endless ways to fail, to get things wrong. And these create the ground for despair in yourself. Okay, the process starts early and never seems to end. And because other people have an investment in your success, students also feel that they aren't a success in these terms, they'll let other people down. Okay, here are just a couple quotes. "It is good to be smart. It's a pressure that gets internalized as, if I don't show I'm smart, I'm letting down people who believe in me." Or another one, "For me, I feel like I have failed the very most when I pass up exciting opportunities or let down, disappoint, or upset other people." Okay. So again, these norms can be quite unforgiving when we're unable to live up to them or achieve what we're expected to achieve. Okay. Let me stop there. And I just, with the sharing, oops, did I stop sharing? No, I didn't. Sorry. Okay. Or did I? Am I still sharing?
No, Joe, that was great. You are not sharing any longer, but we are
Okay,
going
okay.
to ask Brad to join us so that you can share further. And if anyone has any question, please put them in the comment box. Brad will be selecting from among them, and they will be engaging in conversation, and he will be incorporating your comments and your questions as well. So thank you all.
Good. Yeah, thank you. And I didn't get to the third part, but maybe we can take that in the Q&A. Was it, what can we do? And I don't have a long lecture about that, but there are some things it seems to me we can do.
Well, Joe, actually, why don't you go there first? Because I think there are a lot of parents here on this Zoom webinar, and I'm sure that some of them are trying to think about, or teachers, professors.
Uh-oh, I lost him.
help minimize, these problems for our young adults.
Right, right. Well, I'll do this quickly then. First, the problems I've been describing, there's a lot of books that complain of that and blame parents for the sort of problems of youth. But I hope I've suggested these are not really problems about bad parenting. They reflect a cultural scheme of what is good to be that centers almost exclusively on external values and is conveyed by media, peers, schools, etc. However, here's the point I want to make. Parents can unwittingly, or wittingly, I guess, depending on the parent, but I'm guessing the kind of parents that might be tuning in here, they can unwittingly foster this picture by what they say and emphasize, even when what they themselves highly regard are intrinsic values like virtues and rich relationships with other people. Okay, so here's a student. She says, quote, parents don't want their kids to be different in a way that could impact their future success, and they don't want to see their kids as failures by certain societal standards. Many parents place significant importance on their children's educational success, which further forces these kids to believe that their performance dictates their worth. Okay, so there can be a kind of unintended message there about what we focus on. And I don't have time for it, but I had a couple of slides from a survey we did in 2019 that has both parents and teenagers from the same family that are interviewed separately. And we asked the kids what certain thing, they had a long list of things that what was important to them, right? As an adult, what things that they would really seek to be as an adult. And it included things like being famous and influential and going to a good college, long list. And then we asked the parents, gave them the same list and asked which they wanted for their children. Okay. And the parents put a lot more emphasis on what you might call internal qualities, things like being honest, of being a good moral character and so on, while their kids put a lot more emphasis on worldly success. Okay, so you get this gap between what the parents, and then in the survey from other questions, it was clear that the teens thought their parents were a lot more achievement oriented than the parents did. Okay, the parents thought that what they were communicating was something like, what we really want you to be is a good person, right? But what the kids heard seemingly is, we think you want you to be really successful, all right? And that's not really so much a matter of internal qualities as it is tangible achievements, that list of 9 things, right? Those are all external things, things that can be seen, things that can be promoted, and so on, okay? And I might mention a study published in 2017 that explored just this point. They found that adolescents who believed that both of their parents valued character traits as much as or more than achievement exhibited better outcomes at school, greater mental health, and less rule-breaking behavior than peers who believed their parents were primarily achievement-minded. Okay. And then just to quote one other scholar talking about findings like that, and I'll end with this, he says, as parents, we also need to stay vigilant about the hidden messages around achievement that we send our kids every day by what we prioritize, what we admire about others, and what constitutes our time, or what consumes our time and energy, okay? So that's the one thing, small thing, and what I think that parents can really do, which is like, what is it we communicate to our kids about what we value, right? And if we value, right, all of these kind of external things, right, then don't be surprised, right, that, right, by the possibility, right, of a lot of stress and difficulty and anxiety, and so on. You know, I've never met a kid who had an anxiety disorder that was brought on from being too virtuous, right, or being too kind or too generous, right? You get these things arise, right, from these kind of competitive pressures when you're trying to be a certain kind of person and so on. So anyway, that's my one intervention.
Great. So Joe, as we kind of look at the data, there's obviously kind of a way in which this plays out in a gendered manner. One question kind of goes at this, talking about, you know, are females facing more anxiety than males? And I guess I want you just to kind of reflect a little bit more about how the story varies for young men and young women. It seems like for young women, it's more about anxiety and depression. For young men, it can be more like sort of the boys in the basement trend, like where the boys are just not really kind of coming out and engaging school and life, to the fullest. That's sort of how they express their difficulty, where the girls are more likely to sort of, experience anxiety, depression in sort of ways that are visible to psychologists. So, but how would you kind of characterize the difference in how this is expressed for young women and young men, basically?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that question. Part of it is because I haven't done the interviews yet with sort of working class kids. So the kinds of men I'm interviewing are men in college, and but who also have a lot of somewhat similar problems as girls in terms of, again, somewhat lower levels of anxiety and depression and so on, but nonetheless quite real. The comparison data, like comparing yourself on social media, it's always talked about as though it's a girl's problem, but turns out it's not. Boys are doing that at quite similar ways that girls are. Yeah, I don't really know. Again, I don't really have a good answer. Again, a lot of interviews I've done with people who are on medication and so on. And again, if they're on medication, it means they went to the doctor and they got diagnosed and now they're on medication. So it doesn't suggest a difference. But surely, I mean, historically, we know, right, that young men are far more likely to drink and do drugs and other sorts of things as ways to kind of drown their sorrows. Less, in some sense, less institutionally recognized means of things. But again, I still think if you go over to counseling and services here at UVA, man, there are a lot of boys over there, and a lot of ADHD, and a lot of drug taking without a prescription. Taking prescription drugs. So anyway, that's not a great answer, but that's the best. That's the best I got.
So one question here is about consumerism, and just wondering how your thoughts on this topic intersect with consumerism. What role does consumerism play in this anxiety for young adults? And there's also a question here about kind of, is there a chicken and egg problem, where is consumerism kind of an expression of anxiety for young adults as well? So have you thought about kind of the role that certain ideas and norms associated with the consumption of goods, marketing, et cetera, is figuring in the kinds of trends you're talking about tonight?
Oh man, you guys are asking hard questions. Yeah, again, I don't have a good answer to that question. Clearly part of the presentation of self that's so highly valued, right, in terms of looking good and being fit, and being all put together, as a phrase that a lot of young people use, right? They're put together, is that that requires the right resources, right, and the right look, the right way to dress, the right way to. I've always struck by kids, even when they're casually dressed, right? They'll have marks of status, right? Maybe it's the right earrings, maybe it's the right something, but certain ways in which you convey status and so on. Again, that may be related to at least sort of the resources to have the kinds of things, right, that you need to kind of pull off the right presentation of self. And I think that's the main thing I would say about it. There's class differences here, ways in which, and we know that poorer parents and so on will spend more money to make sure their kids can have certain kinds of status, right? They have the right clothing, the right sneakers, the right look, and so on, so that they're not excluded on that basis. I've certainly had many kids talk about, they're sort of the wealthier kids at UVA, right? Or, a place at Brad, Princeton, right? There's like a big gap. We got all these, sons and daughters of super wealthy people, and right, in the kind of classism and so on that might go on. Again, that maybe is related to a kind of consumer use, but Anyway, that's whoever asked the question maybe probably has a better idea of it than I do.
So one question here is, and I know you haven't begun the work kind of on the working class part of this, but there's a question from someone who teaches at a community college, and she sees anxiety and depression among her more working class young adults. But this is kind of linked more towards kind of what she calls a social poverty, poverty of connections and support from their family. She says many are taking care of their parents. Often they're not, they don't have a father kind of actively involved in their lives. So has sort of, you talked a bit about kind of the parenting equation a second ago, but the sort of family instability or, absent fathers or kind of a lack of community support figure in this as well in some way, from what you've seen so far or what you're anticipating to see in your future interviews?
Yeah, certainly. But it's kind of unclear to me just what, well, let me back up a second. So I went looking for data, qualitative data, interview studies, anything people had done with kids, non-college bound kids in high school or college, right? And it is amazing how little there is. Almost all of it is in a couple of narrow fields of study. One of them is what they call it, the preparation for adulthood or something like that, right? Which is purely a kind of whether they're on certain kind of economic tracks and so on. It never asks them what their aspirations are. In fact, it generally doesn't even ask them any questions, right? It's sort of presupposed that working class kids are struggling with the thing, the bodily needs, right? And a roof over their head. And it's only the wealthy kids who are worried about their status, right? And I think that's fundamentally wrong. And I can go back to, Richard Sennett's famous book, The Hidden Injuries of Class in 1972. And it's all about the kind of thing I'm talking about. But now it's adults, not young people, but it's all about working class guys. The hidden injuries of class had to do with all the ways in which working class people feel put down, right? That their aspirations to be successful, to have worth in this world, and so on. And I did find a very small British literature on aspirations. I interviewed one of the lead guys in that, who's now in Australia, right? And but what they found is aspirations among working class are a lot like everybody else's aspirations. What they want to be and do, they too want to be smart. We have a bunch of interviews with parents from working class, and what they want for their kids is not distinguishable for the most part from what other parents want. So, clearly there's a lot of trauma and difficulty among working class people and so on. And I don't mean to diminish that distress, but I also think there's other kinds of distress that are more along these lines and are the kinds of things that might actually give you an anxiety disorder, right? It's not often clear to me that just difficulty in life, struggles, right, and so on, lead to a disorder, right? They just make life hard and challenging. But it's not clear to me that those things necessarily lead to you being depressed, right? That's often something that has to do with the self. And the self isn't necessarily implicated in some of the kinds of challenges that working class people face. I mean, those kinds of difficulties. So anyway, so I need to kind of get to that area but there's not much there. It's surprising. Everybody's focused on college kids.
So we've had two sets of questions about two sort of larger social factors that intersect with young adults, and one is religion and one is economics. And so I'm wondering how kind of the increasingly secular character of adolescence and young adulthood, is part and parcel of the story, perhaps. And then also wondering how the kind of the increasingly the unequal character of our economy is also the kinds of trends that we've been seeing increase in at least the sort of the indicators when it comes to. So again, is secularization part of the story here? And then is growing economic inequality another part of the story here in your kind of
Yeah. And I'll say this not so much from interview data as much as the larger social theory surrounding the world we live in, and how we've come to have this hyper competitive environment, and that clearly is related to changing economic conditions, and the kind of entrepreneurial focus of capitalism in our moment. And I think for a lot of young people, perhaps mistakenly, I think often think that the opportunities are disappearing for them. And so that sense in which you've got to get to the best college or your life is screwed, right? That there's very few pathways, right, to real success, and that they have to somehow, right, meet these markers and meet these standards and so on. And so I think that's creating a kind of clearly competitive feel for young people. But I don't know how much it's really true, in the sense that, right, I think there's probably some evidence, and certainly in some fields, right, like of higher education, opportunities are really drying up and so on. So I understand that, but it's not clear to me that overall there are somehow fewer opportunities. But I do think there's certainly the perception that there are, and it's giving this kind of sense of kind of hyper competitiveness to young people. So I think that the economic is really important, and the secularization. Well, no question. I mean, it's like what is the vision of the good life? Is this kind of meritocratic, entirely sort of secular understanding of what a good person is, and it seems to me that in the interviews there are only two alternatives that kids bring up. One is, instead of trying to meet all these kind of meritocratic norms of selfhood, they're just going to focus on what makes them happy. Okay, which is itself a norm, curiously enough, right? And a certain kind of obligation to be happy, et cetera. So it's not clear to me that that's actually an escape from the system as just another place in it. And then the other one, though, is some kind of life of virtue, which is almost always expressed by people who are people of faith, and not exclusively, but heavily. And in our big study we did in 2019, we had 3,000 parents and 3,000 teens. Right, the one group. So I mean, there was one group. It was about, I forget what percent of the whole sample, maybe about 23%, something like that. Right. Who expressed that doing God's will was actually their most important thing. Now, curiously, that didn't always mean that they thought differently about a lot of things. But there you did have a clear alternative. And so it does seem to me that a kind of secularization, right, is shaping a certain way of thinking about what a good human life is. And the need to kind of grab all the gusto you can get. You only have one life to live your full potential, the self-actualization stuff, which comes from the 60s. I mean, that was clearly a very secular, kind of quasi-religious sort of idea. So anyway, the answer is yes and yes to the economic and secularization.
Trying to stress kind of virtues, character, what David Brooks calls the eulogy virtues, rather than the resume virtues. But your kids are surrounded by, families that are stressing, like Harvard and sports. How do you kind of break out of that pattern? How do you kind of help your kids, avoid this when so many of their peers and so many of their peers' families are caught up in this pursuit of more of the resume virtues rather than the eulogy virtues?
Yeah. Well, I don't have a. Well, first, I don't think the stuff on your resume any of them are actually virtues, but for the most part. But I guess I would say is that there isn't an easy answer to this question. We all face it. We've all struggled with it. And if we haven't, it's because our kids aren't old enough yet. And then you're going to struggle with it. I guess all I can suggest briefly is as I tried to suggest at the end, is to ask ourselves what virtues we live by. And those will often be very, kids are remarkably good at spotting hypocrisy. They're also remarkably good at ferreting out when a parent, kind of the difference between parents in their pious moments and parents in their actual everyday life. We forget that they live with us, right? And they can see what we do, what we value, right? What things do we reward, right? Do we have a bumper sticker that, that our kid is on the honor roll at that school? Okay, that's a kind of statement about what we value and so on, and what we prize. And so I guess I would start, and probably most of us do plenty of this as our own kind of soul searching, right? About how we live and what we value, right? And then how that can be, you have to really live it. And I think if we're living or trying our best to live life of virtue, right, or life by other eulogy virtues, if you will, that may be the single best thing we can do. The other thing, I guess, again, I think people are trying to do this is among their friends or within small groups and so on, either play groups and other kinds of things, where you try to form friendships with people who likewise are trying to live against the grain of the culture, right? And this kind of hyper achievement, competitive thing. So again, I know those are inadequate, but that's a couple of thoughts.
And how much of the trends that you've been sort of thinking about and writing about do you think are driven sort of directly by technology, by smartphones, social media, and the like, and the kinds of competitive dynamics that it fosters, and how much of it is driven by a broader array of shifts in the society? And it's like, how much, basically what the question is sort of how much of this is really all about kind of the Gene Twenge thesis, that sort of smartphones and the new technologies have kind of added up a really difficult dynamic into, or injected into our teens and young adults' lives.
Yeah, well, I think Eugene's view is it tends to focus just on the sort of quantitative, how much phone use. And I think what the study I quoted found, I think, is, and it strikes me as more consistent with my interviews, is that that what the phones have done and these new forms of social media and so on have done is really put in the kind of comparison that's been around for a long time. It didn't come with cell phones, right? People were doing this kind of hyper competitive culture, the rise in anxiety rates and depression. They didn't just happen last year. They've been going on for quite a while. That those things really, it was a kind of accelerant on the fire in which it just blew up. So that you could be in some ways constantly comparing. Imagine waking up every morning. Something like 80% of Americans, the first thing they do in the morning is look at their phone. Imagine waking up every morning to a stream of images of other people's lives, of their things. Overnight, they got a new puppy. They built an orphanage in Nepal. They did something sensational, right? All their kids got accepted into Harvard at the same time or something, that kind of, so I think that is, so I think it really accelerates something. I think this comparison, and it happens in all kinds of other ways. A lot of kids, their main comparison are like their siblings or even their parents, right? And not necessarily even their peers. So I think there are other ways in which this has been going on and was going on, but but social media really taken it to another level.
Yeah, and that's great. We've got, I think I've covered many of the the themes in many of the questions here. And I'm just, well, I guess you've also kind of taught in these themes in these January courses here at UVA. And with the students that you've taught, what is sort of, when they speak to you about these issues, from their vantage point, like what do they sort of describe as the things that are most troublesome to them in their own sort of, like, what are the factors or what are the dynamics that they talk about in your class that are the most of concern to them?
Well, different than what I just what I just spent half an hour talking about. That is the issue. It's the kind of pressure they feel to again, to be a certain kind of person. Their life now has become about choices. You have to make up your life. You have to invent your life, right? And parents have really given up what you might think of as traditional parenthood, right? In which you pass along a way of life and so on. It's really disappeared. And it's been replaced by the parent as a kind of, as your agent, right? That helps you to maximize your life, right? And what you're going to be and so on, right? And so for a lot of students, it's like, how do you know whether your choices are the right ones? How do you know, right? How do you get a life plan? How do you saw with a lot of these quotes I had from the young people, right? Is that they're flying blind here, right? I was telling them what are you supposed to do, right? How are you supposed to make up a life? What does that even mean? Right? And so again, that's a lot of the things that we talk about in that class that I think are sort of driving experiences of feeling inadequate. I have to say that is the single most common experience. People are falling short. They feel inadequate. They're not living up somehow to their potential. They're not doing as well as others. They're not, again, it's not that sort of comparative sense in which they're not standing out and so on. And again, it can take so many forms. It's a sign. I mean, I think the real difference in our world is that the ways to fail have multiplied beyond reckoning. The horizon of possible failures, it just is endless, right? Even if you're smart, you can be a know-it-all. You can not perform it properly. You can, et cetera. So that is the kind of stuff that they share, and it's the same kind of stuff I get when talking with people or interviewing people. Of course, a lot of the students in my class are on medication and have been diagnosed. Like a third, I don't know, something like 25% of UVA students come to school already on a medication, and another bunch of them get it once they get here, and so on. So that is the kind of things that they share and that they find really challenging and difficult. And of course, the institution itself, that's exactly what it promotes. It promotes success on just the exact lines that I was describing. That list of 9 things isn't a model UVA student, and it's the one that the university itself endlessly promotes, right? It's success in just those terms, as a kind of worldly success, if you will.
Right. So I think, the final point that I think you've made is really, I think, particularly striking. Just again, the idea that it's about kind of today, it's about having kind of kids create themselves, de novo, rather than kind of being ushered into, a way of life or a series of traditions that would kind of lend structure and guidance to their lives in a different and probably less stressful way. So, Joe, we're very grateful for having you for our sort of February webinar at IFS, and we'll be posting this online relatively soon, and people can find you at the Institute for Advanced Studies and Culture at the University of Virginia online. So again, we're grateful, Joe. Thanks so much for being with us tonight.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Brad.